Have you ever had to say goodbye to your best friend to give them a better life? Richard, a retired police officer from Montana, faced that decision when he sold Duke, his loyal German Shepherd. What he didn't know was that this choice would change not only Duke's life but an entire community. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this emotional story together. Richard Thompson had spent most of his life in service to others. A retired police officer in his late 60s, he had seen the best and worst of humanity during his years on the force. His lean, tall frame carried the weight of his years and experiences, but it was his sharp blue eyes that hinted at a lifetime of resilience. After retiring, Richard had chosen the quiet life in the rural outskirts of a small Montana town, seeking solace in the company of his loyal German Shepherd, Duke. Duke was more than just a dog. He was a partner, a protector, and Richard's closest confidant. Trained during Richard's time on the force, Duke was intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. The dog's sleek black and tan coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his alert ears seemed to catch even the softest of sounds. But more than his physical prowess, Duke had an uncanny ability to sense danger, a skill that had saved Richard's life on more than one occasion. Life in Montana, however, had not been kind to Richard in recent years. The small pension he received barely covered his modest living expenses. Rising medical bills for his arthritis and the maintenance of his old farmhouse were stretching his finances thin. The once cozy home now felt like a weight he could no longer bear. Bills piled up on the oak kitchen table, their ominous red lettering glaring at him as a daily reminder of his struggles. One evening, as Richard sat by the fireplace with Duke resting at his feet, the weight of his circumstances became unbearable. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, buddy," he said, scratching Duke behind the ears. The dog responded with a soft whine, his amber eyes full of understanding. "You deserve better than this," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "A big yard to run in, people who can afford to care for you. Not an old man who's barely getting by." The decision to sell Duke wasn't easy. Richard spent sleepless nights agonizing over it, pacing the worn wooden floors of his living room. Memories of their time together flooded his mind. The way Duke had guarded him during late-night patrols, their playful hikes in the woods, and the silent comfort the dog offered during his darkest moments. Each memory was a knife to the heart, but Richard convinced himself that this sacrifice was for Duke's own good. The next morning, with a heavy heart, Richard posted an ad online: "Highly trained German Shepherd for sale. Ideal for farm or security work. Contact for details." He hesitated before hitting post, his finger hovering over the button. "This isn't about me," he whispered to himself. "This is about giving you a better life, Duke." It didn't take long for the calls to come in. Most were from people interested in Duke's training or his pedigree, but none of them felt right to Richard. Then, one afternoon, a soft-spoken young woman named Lauren Wilson called. "Hi, Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice warm and genuine. "I saw your ad about Duke. I live on a farm in Wyoming with my family, and I think he might be a great fit for us." Richard's chest tightened. "What kind of farm do you have?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We raise cattle and grow alfalfa," Lauren explained. "It's a big property, plenty of space for a dog like Duke to run around. My dad's a bit skeptical, but I've always believed dogs like him bring more than just protection. They bring heart to a home." Her words struck a chord with Richard. After a lengthy conversation, he invited Lauren to visit and meet Duke. That weekend, Lauren arrived in a dusty blue pickup truck. She was in her late 20s, with auburn hair tied back in a ponytail and a confident but kind demeanor. Her handshake was firm, and her green eyes were alight with curiosity as she met Duke. "He's beautiful," she said, crouching to let Duke sniff her hand. "Hi there, big guy. You're even more impressive than I imagined." Duke, ever discerning, sniffed Lauren's hand cautiously before giving her a gentle nudge with his nose. Richard watched the interaction closely, his emotions a whirlwind. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that this decision might be the right one. Later, as Lauren and Richard sat on the porch discussing Duke's training and personality, Lauren's sincerity became evident. "I promise you," she said, placing a hand on her heart, If you let me take Duke home, he'll be loved and cared for like family." Richard looked away, his throat tightening. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but promise me you'll always put his well-being first." "I promise," Lauren replied, her voice steady. As Lauren drove away with Duke in the back seat of her truck, Richard stood on the porch, fighting back tears. "Take care of her, boy," he whispered. The house felt unbearably empty that night, but Richard consoled himself with the belief that he had done the right thing. The Wilson family farm in Wyoming was a sprawling expanse of golden fields and pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. The property, nestled in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, was a testament to generations of hard work and resilience. Weathered barns, sturdy wooden fences, and a cozy farmhouse with a wraparound porch painted a picture of rustic charm. Lauren Wilson had spent her entire life on this land. At 28, she had become the de facto caretaker of the farm alongside her father, Thomas. Her younger brothers had moved to nearby cities, leaving Lauren to shoulder much of the responsibility. Her love for animals and her deep connection to the land kept her rooted, even when life on the farm became exhausting. When Lauren brought Duke home, the truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, drawing the attention of Thomas, who was repairing a tractor near the barn. He stood up, wiping his grease-streaked hands on a rag, and squinted at the unfamiliar figure in the back of the truck. "What in the world is this?" Thomas asked, his tone equal parts curiosity and disapproval. Lauren stepped out of the truck, her face lit with excitement. "Dad, this is Duke. He's a retired police dog, trained for protection and security. I bought him from a retired cop in Montana. He's incredible." Thomas frowned, his gray mustache twitching as he looked over the large German shepherd sitting upright in the truck bed. Duke's piercing amber eyes met his, unblinking. "We don't need a dog," Thomas grumbled. "We've got fences and you've got your shotgun." Lauren sighed, crossing her arms. "Dad, it's not just about security. He's more than that. You'll see. He'll earn his keep, I promise." Thomas shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Another mouth to feed." Ignoring her father's skepticism, Lauren unloaded Duke and led him toward the farmhouse. The dog moved gracefully, his keen gaze taking in every detail of his new surroundings. Lauren knelt beside him, stroking his fur. "This is your new home, Duke," she said softly. "I know it's different, but you'll love it here. Just give it a chance." Over the next few days, Duke began to adjust to life on the farm. Lauren spent hours introducing him to the property, showing him the barn, the pastures, and the creek that ran through the edge of the land. Duke, ever vigilant, patrolled the perimeter of the farm, his sharp instincts already at work. Lauren couldn't help but marvel at his intelligence and discipline. One evening, while the family gathered for dinner, Lauren brought up Duke's progress. "He's been amazing, Dad," she said, slicing into her steak. "He checks the entire property every morning. He's already started chasing off stray coyotes near the cattle." Thomas grunted, barely looking up from his plate. "That's what the fences are for," he said. "We don't need a dog to do the job we've been doing ourselves for years." Lauren leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not just about doing the job, Dad. Duke's a companion, too. You've seen how sharp he is. He's not just a dog. He's family." Thomas set down his fork, his expression hard. "Family doesn't come with a price tag, Lauren. I know you mean well, but this farm isn't a petting zoo. We need to focus on what's practical." Before Lauren could respond, Duke, who had been lying quietly by the door, suddenly stood up and barked, a deep, resonant sound that commanded attention. The family turned to see him standing alert, his ears perked and his body tense. "What's he barking at?" Thomas asked, getting up from his chair. Lauren followed Duke to the window, peering outside. The fading light of dusk revealed nothing unusual, but Duke's behavior was unshakable. "He senses something," Lauren said, her voice laced with concern. Thomas scoffed. "Probably a rabbit. Let's eat before it gets cold." But Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that Duke's instincts were sharper than Thomas wanted to admit. That night, as the farm fell silent, she lay awake in bed, wondering if Duke had detected something they couldn't see. The following morning, Lauren found Duke sitting by the barn, his watchful eyes scanning the horizon. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she whispered. "You're something special." The Wilson farm began its mornings early, with the first light of dawn spilling over the rolling pastures. It was a place of quiet industry, where the lowing of cattle and the hum of tractors blended into a comforting rhythm of life. Lauren had grown up with this routine, rising before the sun to tend to the animals and check the fences. Now, Duke was part of that rhythm, though his arrival stirred mixed emotions within the family. Lauren's excitement about Duke's presence was palpable. Every morning, she took him on walks around the property, letting him familiarize himself with every corner of the farm. She showed him the creek where the cattle drank, the chicken coop that needed constant guarding against foxes, and the sprawling alfalfa fields where the breeze carried the earthy scent of fresh grass. Duke, with his alert posture and calm demeanor, seemed to absorb every detail, as though mentally mapping his new territory. On the third morning after Duke's arrival, Lauren found her father, Thomas, standing by the barn with his arms crossed, watching the dog as he trotted beside her. "He's still here, huh?" Thomas muttered, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Yes, Dad, he's still here," Lauren replied, exasperation creeping into her tone. "And he's been doing exactly what I said he'd do. Helping? You'd know if you gave him a chance." Thomas gestured toward the barn. "Helping? How?" "The cows are still in the pasture. The coyotes are still out there, and the fences don't fix themselves. Maybe you didn't notice the lack of coyotes in the last 2 nights," Lauren shot back. "He's already doing his job." Thomas shook his head. "We've managed this farm for decades without a dog. You're trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist." Their argument was cut short when Duke suddenly stood still, his body rigid and his ears perked, his amber eyes fixed on a distant tree line near the pasture. He let out a low, guttural growl, the sound so deep it sent a chill down Lauren's spine. "What is it, Duke?" Lauren asked, her voice lowering instinctively. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Thomas frowned. "Probably a squirrel," he said dismissively, turning to go back to his work. But Lauren trusted Duke's instincts. She grabbed a pair of binoculars from the barn and scanned the tree line. At first, she saw nothing but swaying branches. Then, a flicker of movement caught her eye, something metallic glinting in the sunlight. Her stomach tightened. "Dad, wait," she called, her voice urgent. Thomas turned, his brow furrowed. "What now?" Lauren handed him the binoculars. "Look over there, by the trees." Thomas sighed but obliged. When his eyes landed on the glint of metal, his expression darkened. "Damn it," he muttered. "Someone's out there. What do we do?" Lauren asked, her heart pounding. Thomas handed the binoculars back to her and strode toward the house. "I'll grab the shotgun. You stay here with the dog." "No way," Lauren protested. "I'm coming with you." "Lauren, don't argue with me," Thomas snapped, his voice sharp. "If there's someone out there, we don't know what they're up to. Stay with Duke and keep your phone handy." Before Lauren could argue further, Thomas disappeared into the house. Duke, sensing the tension, stayed close to her side, his growl now a low rumble. Lauren placed a hand on his head, trying to steady her own nerves. "It's okay, Duke," she whispered, though the words felt more like an attempt to calm herself than the dog. A few minutes later, Thomas returned with the shotgun slung over his shoulder. He didn't say a word as he headed toward the tree line, his steps purposeful. Lauren watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Duke let out a bark, as if urging her to follow, but she hesitated, torn between obeying her father and trusting her instincts. Suddenly, Duke bolted, his powerful legs carrying him toward Thomas. "Duke," Lauren called, running after him despite her father's warning. Thomas stopped in his tracks as Duke reached him, standing protectively in front of him and barking furiously toward the trees. The sound echoed across the pasture, startling a flock of birds into flight. Thomas raised his shotgun, his eyes scanning the woods. "Whoever's out there, you'd better leave," Thomas shouted, his voice firm. "This is private property." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, The sound of hurried footsteps retreating through the underbrush reached their ears. Thomas lowered his gun, his jaw clenched. "Cowards," he muttered. Lauren reached them, breathless. "What was it?" "Couldn't see," Thomas admitted, his voice grim. "But they were there." Duke stood between them, his gaze still fixed on the tree line, his growl fading only when the footsteps disappeared completely. Lauren knelt beside him, running her hands through his fur. "Good boy," she murmured. "You did good." Thomas sighed, his expression softening as he looked at Duke. "Maybe he's not just a luxury after all," he said quietly. Lauren glanced up at her father, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Told you," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Thomas gave her a faint nod. "Let's just hope he's as good as you think he is." As they walked back to the farmhouse, Duke kept his head high and his ears perked, ever watchful. For the first time, Thomas began to see the dog not as a burden, but as a guardian, a silent protector in a world that could be unpredictable and dangerous. Over the next few weeks, rumors of strange activity began to circulate around the quiet Wyoming countryside. Neighbors stopped by the Wilson farm to share whispers of tools disappearing from sheds, gates mysteriously left open, and in one particularly alarming case, a pair of young calves stolen from a nearby ranch. The Wilsons' closest neighbor, Bill Harper, was especially shaken. "It's not just kids messing around," Bill said one afternoon, standing by the Wilsons' barn. His weathered face was tight with worry, and his voice was low. "Whoever's doing this knows what they're after. They hit my place 2 nights ago, took a generator and some fuel cans. I've got nothing left to lock up." Lauren listened intently, her arms crossed against the cold wind that swept through the valley. Thomas stood beside her, arms resting on his hips as he furrowed his brow. "And no one saw anything?" Thomas asked. Bill shook his head. "Nothing. My dogs didn't bark. My cameras didn't catch a thing. It's like they just walked in and out without a trace." Lauren glanced down at Duke, who sat attentively by her side, his ears perked and his sharp amber eyes scanning the horizon as if he understood every word. "They won't pull that off here," Lauren said firmly. "Not with Duke watching over us." Bill gave the dog a skeptical glance. "Hope you're right, but you'd better be careful. Seems like these folks don't care who they target." After Bill left, Thomas and Lauren stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the crisp autumn air. Finally, Thomas broke the quiet. "We need to keep an eye out," he said, his voice firm. "I'll check the locks on the barn and the tool shed. You make sure nothing's left out in the open." Lauren nodded, but felt a growing sense of unease. The Wilson farm was large, with countless nooks and crannies that could easily be exploited by someone determined enough. She looked down at Duke and placed a hand on his head. "You ready to help us, boy?" she asked softly. Duke responded with a low bark, his tail wagging slightly but his expression serious. Lauren smiled despite herself. "Good, because we're going to need you." That night, Lauren sat on the porch, her jacket wrapped tightly around her as she sipped a cup of tea. Duke sat beside her, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the tree line that bordered the far edge of the property. The stars above glittered in the clear night sky, but the peaceful setting did little to ease Lauren's nerves. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. Thomas joined her a few minutes later, settling into the chair beside hers. "You planning to sit out here all night?" he asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Maybe," Lauren replied. She looked over at him. "Do you really think we'll be next?" Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know, but if they come, we'll be ready." Lauren glanced down at Duke, who hadn't moved from his watchful position. "He'll warn us if something's wrong," she said, more to reassure herself than her father. Thomas studied the dog for a moment, then nodded. "He's got good instincts. I'll give him that." The following morning, Lauren woke early to find Duke pacing near the barn. His behavior had become increasingly vigilant over the past few days, as though he sensed the growing tension on the farm. Lauren followed him to the barn, where he stopped and stared intently at the doors. "What is it, Duke?" she asked, her voice low. She pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, her boots crunching on the hay-strewn floor. Everything seemed in order at first glance. The tools were still on their hooks, and the feed bags were stacked neatly in the corner. But Duke remained on edge, his nose to the ground as he sniffed along the edges of the walls. Lauren's pulse quickened. "Did someone try to get in here?" she whispered, crouching beside the dog. At that moment, Thomas entered the barn, his steps brisk. "What's going on?" he asked. "Duke's acting like something's off," Lauren replied. "I think someone might have been here." Thomas frowned and began inspecting the barn himself. He noticed a pile of hay near the back that looked like it had been disturbed. "This wasn't like this yesterday," he muttered, moving the hay aside with his boot. Underneath, they found the faint outline of boot prints in the dirt. Thomas swore under his breath. "Looks like they've been scoping the place out." Lauren's stomach churned. Why didn't they take anything? "Could be they were just checking to see if it's worth the trouble," Thomas said grimly. "Or maybe Duke scared them off before they could do anything." Lauren placed a hand on Duke's back. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. The dog's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. Thomas straightened up, his expression hard. "We're setting up extra lights and locking this place down. And we'll take turns keeping watch at night." Lauren nodded. "And Duke?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Let him do what he's good at." As they walked back to the house, Lauren couldn't help but feel a surge of pride in Duke. He wasn't just a dog, he was their protector. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they wouldn't face them alone. The next few nights on the Wilson farm were tense. Thomas had installed motion-activated floodlights around the barn and the tool shed, their harsh beams cutting through the darkness whenever anything moved. Lauren had taken to carrying a flashlight and a sturdy walking stick during her evening rounds, while Thomas kept his shotgun close at hand. But the real guardian of the farm was Duke. It was during one of these nights that Duke's instincts proved invaluable. Lauren had just finished checking the locks on the barn and was heading back to the house. The sky was a deep navy, scattered with stars, and the air was crisp enough to sting her cheeks. Duke was trotting alongside her, his body alert as he scanned the horizon. They were halfway to the porch when Duke suddenly froze. His ears perked up, his tail stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Lauren stopped immediately, her heart pounding. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, gripping the flashlight tighter. Duke's growl grew louder, his amber eyes fixed on a shadow near the far side of the pasture. Lauren followed his gaze and squinted into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. But then, just beyond the reach of the floodlights, she caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting between the trees near the fence line. Her breath hitched. "Dad!" she yelled, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. The farmhouse door flew open, and Thomas stepped out, shotgun in hand. "What's going on?" he barked. Lauren pointed toward the pasture. "Someone's out there. I saw them near the trees." Thomas squinted into the darkness, his face grim. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping off the porch. "No way," Lauren protested. "I'm coming with you." But before Thomas could respond, Duke took off, his powerful legs propelling him toward the pasture. "Duke, no," Lauren shouted, her voice laced with panic. Thomas cursed under his breath. "Damn dog. Stay close to me, Lauren." They followed Duke as quickly as they could, the beam of Lauren's flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. By the time they reached the edge of the pasture, Duke was barking furiously, his body positioned between the intruder and the fence. The figure, now clearly a man, stood frozen in the light of the flood lamp, his face obscured by a hood. "Don't move," Thomas commanded, raising his shotgun. "You're on private property." The man hesitated for a moment, then bolted toward the fence. Duke lunged after him, his barks echoing into the night. Lauren's flashlight caught a flash of the man's face as he turned to glance back, a thin, scruffy man in his 20s, with a look of panic in his wide eyes. He scrambled over the fence, disappearing into the woods. "Let him go," Thomas said, lowering the shotgun. "Duke, heel." Duke hesitated for a moment, his body trembling with adrenaline, but he obeyed Thomas's command, trotting back to them with his ears pinned back. Lauren knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice shaking. You scared him off. Thomas exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. They're testing us, he muttered, seeing how far they can push before we fight back. Lauren looked up at her father. Do you think they'll come back? Thomas nodded grimly. Probably. But now they know we're ready for them. The next morning, the tension around the farm was palpable. Over breakfast, Thomas laid out a plan to increase security. We'll set up more lights and double-check the locks on the back gates, he said. And I want to set up a rotation for night watch. They're not getting past us again. Lauren nodded, but couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. What about Duke? She asked. Should we keep him closer to the house? Thomas shook his head. Let him do what he does best. He's the reason we scared that guy off last night. I trust him. Lauren smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Duke, lying by the door, looked up at the sound of his name, his tail thumping against the floor. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lauren sat on the porch with Duke at her feet. The events of the previous night had only deepened her appreciation for the dog's instincts. She scratched behind his ears, her voice soft. You're our guardian, aren't you, boy? They don't stand a chance with you here. Duke responded with a soft whine, leaning into her touch. For a brief moment, the worries of the world faded, and Lauren felt a sense of security she hadn't known in weeks. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The intruders would come back, of that she was certain, and when they did, Duke would be ready. The Wilson farm was bathed in the silver glow of a full moon the night everything changed. The stillness of the crisp Wyoming evening was broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the farmhouse, Lauren was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, while Thomas sat in the living room, flipping through an old farming catalog. Duke lay near the door, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at every faint sound. The peaceful night was shattered by a sudden, sharp bark from Duke. He sprang to his feet, his entire body tense and alert. Lauren froze, her soapy hands hovering above the sink. Dad, she called, her voice trembling. Something's wrong. Thomas was already on his feet, grabbing his shotgun from beside the door. Duke let out another bark, this one more urgent, and began pacing near the back door, growling low in his throat. Stay here, Thomas ordered, his voice firm but calm. Not a chance, Lauren shot back, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the counter. She clicked it on and followed her father out the back door, with Duke leading the way. The night was eerily quiet as they stepped onto the porch. Duke sniffed the air, his growls growing deeper. Lauren's heart pounded as she scanned the property with her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed still, but Duke's behavior left no doubt. Something was out there. Then, they heard it, a faint metallic clink coming from the barn. Thomas froze, his grip tightening on the shotgun. Someone's trying to get in, he whispered. Duke took off like a bolt of lightning, his barks echoing across the yard. Lauren and Thomas followed, their boots crunching on the frosty grass. As they approached the barn, the floodlights clicked on, illuminating the structure and casting long shadows across the ground. The barn doors were slightly ajar, and a figure was crouched near the latch, fumbling with a crowbar. Hey, Thomas bellowed, raising the shotgun. Step away from the barn. The intruder whipped around, his face momentarily illuminated by the floodlights. He was a lanky man in his 30s, wearing a black hoodie and jeans. His eyes widened in panic as he dropped the crowbar and bolted toward the tree line. But Duke was faster. The German shepherd barreled after the man, his powerful strides closing the distance in seconds. The intruder let out a startled yell as Duke lunged, snapping at his heels and forcing him to trip and fall. Thomas and Lauren reached the scene moments later. Duke stood over the man, his teeth bared and his growl low and menacing. The man lay on the ground, his hands raised in surrender, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Call the sheriff, Thomas said to Lauren, his voice steady but tense. Lauren nodded, pulling her phone from her pocket. She kept her flashlight trained on the man as she dialed, her fingers trembling. This is Lauren Wilson, she said when the dispatcher answered. We've got an intruder on our property, the Wilson farm, outside of Sheridan. Send someone fast. As Lauren spoke, Thomas kept the shotgun trained on the man, who began to plead. I wasn't gonna take anything, he stammered. I swear. I was just looking around. Looking around with a crowbar? Thomas retorted, his voice cold. Doesn't sound like sightseeing to me. The man fell silent, his gaze darting nervously between Thomas and Duke, who remained poised to strike if necessary. Lauren stepped closer to her father, her voice low. Do you think he's alone? Thomas's jaw tightened. Doubt it. They've probably got someone waiting in the woods. Minutes later, the sheriff's patrol car pulled into the driveway, its lights flashing. Two deputies stepped out, one of them nodding in greeting. Evening, Thomas. Lauren. Looks like you've had some excitement. Caught this guy trying to break into the barn, Thomas explained, gesturing with the shotgun. Duke stopped him before he could get far. The deputies quickly handcuffed the man and began questioning him. As they worked, one of them turned to Lauren. You've got yourself a hell of a dog there, he said, nodding toward Duke. Lauren knelt beside Duke, running her hands through his fur. He's more than a dog, she said softly. He's family. As the deputies led the man to the patrol car, one of them paused to address Thomas. We'll question him back at the station, but I'd bet good money he's part of the group that's been hitting the other farms. You might want to keep a close eye on things for the next few nights. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. We will. That night, after the deputies left, Lauren and Thomas sat in the living room, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Duke lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes still alert. You were right about him, Thomas said after a long silence, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't think we needed him, but he saved us tonight. Lauren smiled, her eyes welling with tears. He's more than I ever hoped for. Thomas reached down, giving Duke a rare pat on the head. Good boy, Duke, he said softly. You've earned your place here. As the farmhouse fell into silence, Lauren felt a deep sense of gratitude. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together, with Duke leading the way. The news of the attempted break-in at the Wilson farm spread quickly through the tight-knit community. By sunrise, neighbors were stopping by, their trucks kicking up dust in the gravel driveway as they offered support and shared their own growing concerns. Bill Harper was one of the first to arrive, his expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. You really caught one of them? Bill asked, leaning against his truck. His weathered hands clenched the brim of his hat nervously. Duke caught him, Lauren corrected, glancing down at the German shepherd who sat proudly by her side. The deputies took him in last night. They think he's part of a group. Bill shook his head. This is getting worse than I thought. I've been locking everything up tight, but I don't sleep easy anymore. Thomas joined them, his face lined with the exhaustion of a sleepless night. We can't keep handling this one farm at a time, he said. We need to do something together. Lauren nodded, her determination growing. We should organize a community meeting. If these thieves are targeting all of us, we'll stand a better chance if we work as a group. That evening, the Wilson farm became the gathering place for nearly every farmer in the area. Neighbors packed into the barn, their voices echoing off the wooden walls as they exchanged stories of stolen equipment, missing livestock, and eerie encounters. Lauren stood at the front of the group with Thomas by her side, trying to channel the confidence she had seen in her father countless times. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. We've all been dealing with the same problem, thieves targeting our farms. Last night, we had a break-in, but Duke here stopped it before anything was taken. She gestured to the dog, who was lying by her feet, his ears flicking at the sound of his name. Murmurs of admiration rippled through the crowd. One man, a younger rancher named Mike, spoke up. I've been thinking about getting a dog like that myself. Looks like he's worth his weight in gold. Lauren smiled faintly. He is, but this isn't just about having a good dog. We need to come together as a community. If we share information, keep an eye on each other's properties, and maybe even patrol the area in shifts, we can make it a lot harder for these thieves to keep doing what they're doing. The crowd murmured again, this time with agreement. Bill Harper stepped forward, his face set with determination. She's right. We've been sitting back, waiting for someone else to fix this. It's time we do something about it. Thomas took over, his deep voice cutting through the noise. Here's what I propose. We organize a patrol system. Every night, we'll have a few people out driving the roads, watching for anything suspicious. And if anyone hears or sees anything, they call the group immediately. We're stronger together than we are alone. The crowd nodded in agreement, the tension in the room beginning to ease as people realized they had a plan. Lauren felt a swell of pride as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, united by a common purpose. As the meeting ended and the neighbors began to disperse, Lauren stood outside the barn, watching the tail lights of trucks disappearing down the dirt road. Thomas came to stand beside her, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You did good tonight," he said quietly. "So did you," Lauren replied, glancing at him with a small smile. "I think people are finally starting to feel like we can fight back." Thomas nodded, his gaze distant. "We'll need to stay sharp, though. These thieves won't give up easy." Lauren looked down at Duke, who was sitting at her feet, his amber eyes scanning the darkened horizon. "We've got him," she said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "They'll think twice before coming back here." The following nights saw the community's plan put into action. Groups of neighbors took turns patrolling the area, their truck headlights cutting through the darkness as they watched for any signs of trouble. At the Wilson farm, Duke remained ever vigilant, his sharp senses catching every rustle of the wind and distant noise. Lauren found herself growing more confident with each passing day. The farm felt safer knowing that their neighbors were watching out for them, and Duke's presence gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in weeks. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the thieves weren't done yet. One night, as Lauren sat on the porch with Duke by her side, she turned to the dog, her voice soft but firm. "We're ready for them, aren't we, boy?" Duke responded with a quiet bark, his tail wagging slightly. Lauren smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. No matter what lay ahead, she knew they had the strength of their community and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who had already proven himself a hero. A week passed with no incidents, and the newfound sense of security within the community began to grow. The patrol system was working well, with neighbors coordinating shifts and reporting any suspicious activity. The Wilson farm remained a central hub for communication, and Duke was widely regarded as the farm's guardian, a role he seemed to take to heart. But Duke's instincts, as sharp as ever, soon reminded everyone that the threat hadn't disappeared entirely. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Lauren decided to visit their neighbor, Jim Sanders, to discuss the patrol schedules. Jim's farm was only a short drive away, nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by pine trees. As Lauren pulled into the gravel driveway, Duke sat upright in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Jim, a stocky man in his late 50s, greeted Lauren warmly at the porch. "Good to see you, Lauren," he said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "You brought the famous Duke, I see." Lauren smiled and patted Duke's head. "He doesn't let me go anywhere without him these days." Jim chuckled. "Smart dog. Come on inside. Coffee's on." As Lauren and Jim sat at the kitchen table, discussing the upcoming patrol rotations, Duke wandered around the house, his nose to the ground. He seemed unusually alert, sniffing every corner and doorway with a sense of purpose. Lauren noticed his behavior and frowned slightly. "Duke's acting strange," she said, turning to Jim. "Has anyone been by recently?" Jim shook his head. "Not that I know of." "Why?" Before Lauren could answer, Duke let out a low growl, his ears pinned back as he stared toward the back door. The sound was enough to send a chill down Lauren's spine. She stood up, her voice calm but firm. "Duke, what is it?" Jim followed her gaze, his brow furrowed. "That's just the mudroom. Nothing back there but boots and jackets." But Duke's growl deepened, and he took a step forward, his body tense. Lauren trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. "Jim, has anyone been working here? Any new hires or visitors?" Jim scratched his head, his expression thoughtful. "Well, now that you mention it, Kyle's been coming by to help out. He's been doing odd jobs around the place." Lauren's stomach tightened. Kyle was a young man in his early 20s who had recently started working for another neighbor, Bill Harper. While she didn't know him well, She had noticed Duke's unusual reaction to him during a community meeting the week before. The dog had refused to relax in Kyle's presence, his gaze fixed on him as if sensing something no one else could. "Do you know where Kyle is now?" Lauren asked, her tone sharp with urgency. Jim shrugged. "He left a couple hours ago. Said he had errands to run in town." Lauren exchanged a glance with Duke, who was now pacing near the back door. "I don't want to alarm you," she said carefully, "but Duke doesn't trust him. And he hasn't been wrong yet." Jim's face darkened. "You think he's involved with the break-ins?" "I don't know," Lauren admitted, "but it's worth looking into." That evening, back at the Wilson farm, Lauren shared her concerns with Thomas. "Duke was acting the same way around Kyle as he did the night of the break-in," she explained. "I think we need to keep an eye on him." Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. "If Duke's picking up on something, we can't ignore it. I'll call Bill and let him know. Maybe we can figure out where this kid's been hanging around." Lauren sat down beside Duke, who was lying at her feet but still looked alert. She scratched behind his ears, her voice soft. "You've got a gift, you know that? If Kyle's hiding something, we'll find out." The next day, Bill Harper stopped by the Wilson farm with an update. "You were right to be suspicious," he told Lauren and Thomas, his expression grim. "I went through some of my old security footage from the night my generator went missing. Guess who I saw lurking near the barn?" "Kyle," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bill nodded. "Clear as day. He must have slipped in when the cameras weren't pointed his way. I didn't even think to check before." Thomas's face hardened. "We need to let the sheriff know." Lauren stood, her mind racing. "If Kyle's involved, he might be working with someone else. We need to be careful. He could be watching any one of us." Bill agreed. "I'll pass the word to the others. Let's tighten up the patrols and keep our eyes open." That night, as Lauren prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Duke lay at the foot of her bed, his steady breathing a comfort in the stillness. "You saw something in Kyle," she murmured, her fingers brushing through his fur. "I just hope we're ready for whatever comes next." Duke's ears twitched, and he let out a quiet huff, as if to say, "I'll be ready." Lauren smiled faintly, but her heart remained heavy. The farm was safe for now, but the danger felt closer than ever. Tensions in the community reached a boiling point in the days following the revelation about Kyle. The neighbors, who had once thought the break-ins were the work of a random gang, now suspected a deeper, more coordinated effort. Patrols were doubled, lights installed in even the most remote corners of properties, and weapons kept within arm's reach at all times. Despite these precautions, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the thieves made their next move. At the Wilson farm, Lauren and Thomas worked tirelessly to prepare. Duke's behavior had become even more vigilant. Every sound, every movement in the dark seemed to draw his attention. Lauren trusted him implicitly, knowing that his instincts were their best defense. It was a moonless night when Duke's warnings turned into action. Lauren was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, while Thomas sat on the porch with Duke lying at his feet. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool Wyoming breeze. But then Duke stood abruptly, his ears pricked and his body tense. He let out a single, low growl, a sound that made Thomas sit up straight. "Lauren," Thomas called, his voice low but urgent. Lauren appeared at the door, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it?" Thomas gestured to Duke, who was now pacing the porch, his growl deepening. "He hears something." Lauren's stomach dropped. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Thomas could answer, Duke took off, bounding down the steps and across the yard toward the barn. Thomas grabbed his shotgun and flashlight, motioning for Lauren to stay close. "Stick behind me," he ordered. They followed Duke, their boots crunching on the gravel. As they approached the barn, the floodlights snapped on, illuminating 3 figures near the doors. One of them was Kyle. He was holding a crowbar, his face twisted with frustration as he tried to pry open the lock. "Stop right there," Thomas shouted, raising his shotgun. The men froze, their faces illuminated by the harsh light. Kyle dropped the crowbar, his hands shooting up in mock surrender. "Whoa, whoa!" he said, a nervous laugh escaping him. We're just— Save it, Thomas snapped. You're trespassing. The sheriff's already on his way. Lauren felt her pulse quicken as she watched the other two men exchange a glance. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, took a step forward, his hand reaching into his jacket. We don't want any trouble, he said, his voice dripping with false calm. But we're not leaving empty-handed. Before Thomas could react, Duke sprang into action. The dog lunged at the man, his powerful jaws clamping onto his arm and forcing him to drop the object he had been reaching for, a knife. The man screamed, trying to shake Duke off, but the dog held firm, his growls echoing through the night. Duke down, Lauren shouted, her voice steady despite her fear. At her command, Duke released the man, who stumbled back, clutching his arm. The other two men took advantage of the chaos, bolting toward the tree line. Go after them, Thomas barked. Duke hesitated for a split second before chasing after the fleeing men. His speed was unmatched, and within moments, he had brought one of them down, pinning him to the ground. The other man disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the distance. By the time the sheriff arrived, Duke had returned to the barn, his fur bristling but his stance calm. The deputies quickly handcuffed the two captured men and began questioning them. Kyle, looking pale and defeated, was led to one of the patrol cars, his head hanging low. As the sheriff approached Thomas and Lauren, he tipped his hat. Looks like you folks caught yourself a pack of troublemakers. We've been after this group for months. They've been targeting the farms all over, Lauren said, her voice firm. They thought they could get away with it. The sheriff nodded, his expression serious. They're smart. I'll give them that. But they underestimated your dog. If it weren't for Duke, they might have gotten away tonight. Lauren knelt beside Duke, wrapping her arms around his neck. Good boy, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're a hero. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softening as he looked at the dog. He's more than a hero, he said. He's family. In the days that followed, the community rallied around the Wilsons, grateful for their courage and Duke's quick instincts. The two captured men confessed to their involvement in a string of robberies across the region, leading to the arrest of the entire group. For the first time in weeks, the farms felt safe again. Lauren and Thomas organized a small gathering at the farm to celebrate. Neighbors brought food and drinks, and Duke was the center of attention, basking in the affection of the people he had protected. Lauren stood on the porch, watching the scene with a deep sense of pride. You've done something amazing, you know that? She said, scratching Duke behind the ears. Duke leaned into her touch, his tail wagging lazily. For the first time in weeks, the farm felt peaceful, and Lauren knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together, with Duke leading the way. The Wilson farm was alive with celebration. Neighbors filled the yard, their laughter and conversations blending with the sound of clinking glasses and the occasional bark from Duke, who roamed among the guests like a proud host. Tables were set up under strings of warm, glowing lights, laden with homemade pies, casseroles, and freshly baked bread. The atmosphere was one of relief, gratitude, and renewed camaraderie. Lauren stood by the porch, a smile tugging at her lips as she watched Duke weave through the crowd. Children patted his head, their laughter ringing out as he wagged his tail enthusiastically. Adults paused in their conversations to offer him a scratch behind the ears or a kind word. It was clear that Duke had become more than just a dog to the community. He was a symbol of resilience and unity. Thomas, holding a glass of iced tea, stepped up beside Lauren. You see that? He asked, nodding toward Duke. He's soaking it all in. Lauren chuckled. He deserves it. He kept this whole farm, and probably the rest of the community, safe. Thomas took a sip of his tea, his gaze softening. I wasn't sure about him at first, he admitted. But now? I can't imagine this place without him. Lauren smiled, her heart swelling with pride. I told you he was special. As the sun set, the crowd gathered around a makeshift podium near the barn. Bill Harper, wearing his best flannel shirt and a wide grin, stepped up to address the group. All right, folks, settle down now, he called, his deep voice commanding attention. We're here tonight to celebrate more than just the end of a bad time. We're here to honor the one who made it all possible." The crowd erupted in cheers, and all eyes turned to Duke, who sat calmly by Lauren's side. His ears perked up at the noise, and he tilted his head as if trying to understand the excitement. "This dog," Bill continued, pointing at Duke, "isn't just any dog. He's the reason those thieves are behind bars, and he's the reason we can all sleep a little easier at night. So let's give a round of applause for Duke, the hero of the Wilson farm." The cheers grew louder, and Lauren knelt beside Duke, wrapping her arms around his neck. "That's for you, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Duke licked her cheek in response, his tail wagging furiously. Thomas stepped forward then, holding a small plaque he had made earlier that week. It was simple but heartfelt, engraved with the words, "Duke, protector of the Wilson farm and friend to all. We wanted to do something to show how much you mean to us," Thomas said, crouching to place the plaque on the barn wall. He turned to Duke, his voice softening. "You're more than a dog. You're family." The night wore on, and as the crowd began to thin, Lauren found herself sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars twinkle above. Duke lay beside her, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur. "You know," she said quietly, "I don't think I've ever felt this safe before. Not just because of you, but because of what you've done for all of us." Duke let out a soft huff, as if to say, "It's my job." Lauren smiled, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "You're more than a dog, Duke. You're my partner, my protector, and my best friend." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You coming in?" he asked. "In a minute," Lauren replied, her voice soft. She looked down at Duke, who had already drifted off to sleep. "We'll be here." The farm felt different after that night. There was a renewed sense of peace and purpose, not just for the Wilsons but for the entire community. Duke continued his daily patrols, his sharp instincts keeping the farm safe. But there was a calmness to him now, a quiet confidence that came from knowing his place in the world. Lauren often found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The break-ins, the patrols, the moments of fear and triumph. They had all led to this. And through it all, Duke had been the constant, guiding them with his unwavering loyalty and courage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Lauren stood by the fence, watching Duke chase a butterfly through the tall grass. She couldn't help but laugh, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the breeze. "For everything." Duke stopped for a moment, turning to look at her as if he had heard. His tail wagged, and he bounded back toward her, his eyes bright and full of life. Lauren knelt to meet him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're our hero, Duke," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Always." And in that moment, under the vast Wyoming sky, there was no doubt in her mind that Duke had found his forever home and his forever purpose. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you've watched until here, comment, "I watched until here," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that's showing on the end screen for you. It's super exciting.